All right, so I'm back. My name's Aaron Lolito. I'm here with Chris Vogt and two contributors to January's issue number 12. So I'll kind of start with just a quick introduction. You know me and Chris if you've listened to previous roundtables, and we have two newcomer guests. So I'll give it to you, Rachel.
Hi, I'm Rachel Pruzan. I am an artist, a fine artist. I paint using alcohol ink, pigment sticks, and traditional oil paints. And I am based out of good old New Jersey, right outside of New York City. And I have a piece called Shinrin Yoku in issue 12 of Wild Roof Journal. And I'm excited to be here.
Thanks, Rachel. And Mary Beth.
Hi, folks. I'm Mary Beth Holloman. I'm based in Anchorage, Alaska. I am a writer. I've published creative nonfiction, and I have a book of poetry coming out in August from Red Hen Press. It'll be my first collection of poetry. And I have a poem in issue 12 called 52 that's going to be part of that poetry collection next summer. So I'm very excited about that. And I'm really excited to be here. I think this is a really cool format. So thanks for inviting me.
Yeah, you're welcome. Great to hear. So yeah, exciting to have a collection coming out. So yeah, it's cool to have a preview of one of the pieces in that collection in the issue. So that's the poem 52 in Gallery 1 from issue 12.
The poem is stunning, by the way. I really loved it.
Thank you.
You know, I think we'll jump into one of our pieces that we'll discuss today, and we'll start with the visual piece. We got a couple of prose pieces, maybe even a poem, but the visual piece was from Jolene Armstrong. The title, "Sunflower Cosmos," and Rachel, that was one of your selections. So
yeah,
really, like out of the pieces in the issue, if you wouldn't mind just throwing out there, like what made that one stand out to you?
Sure. Taking your lead, obviously, it was, I'm commenting strictly subjectively, on the pieces I chose. But what spoke to me first was that I was sort of drawn into the center of this very detailed piece. And my eyes visually, I got sort of lost, happily lost in the details of it. So it actually took me, even though the title of the piece is Sunflower Cosmos, it took me a minute to realize I was actually looking at a sunflower because I was so lost in the beautiful sort of cellular, molecular-like detail of the piece. I really, it sort of reminded me of a lot of things. One is, just an overall commentary on perspective, right? How, we can get so lost in the details of our own, lives that you have to remind yourself to sort of step back, and there's always another perspective, right? We're always looking through our own distorted lenses, the lenses of our experience or where we're standing or whatever. And then it also reminded me of sort of how the detail is very organic and cellular looking, and how the sort of the geometry and patterns are, repeated in nature. And I know there must be a word for that. I just don't know what it is, where you have like, sort of like the irises of your eyes, the lines in the irises of your eyes also look like sort of branches of trees and things like that. This obviously reminded me of, sort of a Milky Way kind of thing in space, right? Which this alludes to the word cosmos in there. And also, like I said, cellular type shapes, molecular stuff, as if you're looking at things through a microscope. So, off the top of my head, those are my initial thoughts. And then just visually, the colors I thought were just beautiful.
Yeah, great. Anybody else want to throw something in there with that piece?
Yeah, the phrase that came to me looking at it was the world in a grain of sand. This idea of the micro and the macro being so similar, like you pointed out, Rachel. And I think there probably is a word for that, similar forms of nature, but I've always been fascinated by that. And because you just see it everywhere, and those repeated forms. And again, like you said, Rachel, I too started out looking, because of the title too, Cosmos, I was looking at it as, and all the pieces around it. There's so much in this issue, and especially in that section having to do with stars and skies and that whole theme. And so at first, I too didn't even realize I was looking at a sunflower, but it was just gorgeous. And two, the cycles of life apparent in there because of the element of apparent decay that may be going on with the sunflower at the same time, that sense of earth that comes in with the seeds and everything. Yeah, I thought it was a gorgeous piece. So thanks for picking that one out.
Oh, good. Yeah. Yep. It's it is really validating to hear that you're seeing some of the same stuff. And I hadn't considered, of course, how the cycle of life stuff comes into play there, and of course fits in with this part of the journal. That's cool.
When the very first time I saw it, I had no idea what to expect. I wasn't even sure if it was going to be a visual piece or if it was going to be written text. So I had zero preconceived notions. And I have to admit, my very first gut reaction was a little creepy. I got kind of an H.R. Geiger alien feel, the little egg, which of course gets you into a lot of sexual territory, and also brings you back to birth and death and decay. I don't know why they let me do this, but I was like 23 or 24, and they let me teach an American literature class at a university in Texas that I had no right to be teaching at the time. But I was obsessed with Walden at the time, and so I was, trying to teach them bits and pieces of Walden. And one of the sections I got obsessed with because there was this implication of a mathematical expression in nature. And what I was able to pull out of it was the Fibonacci sequence, or the golden mean. So there's the ratio of where the eye occurs on a perfect face. This ratio then also gets expressed in the sunflower. If you look at the seeds, the outgrowth is the same 2-5-1 pattern, which is also what you see in the unspooling of galaxies. So now superimposing that actually makes this similar. It's still a little frightening to me. There's something kind of maybe cosmic horror, I think, because that was my first reaction, was almost a phobic response. But then you kind of superimpose the universal stuff that adds a nice layer where it's still a little creepy, but it's also kind of awesome and inspiring. It's still reminding you that stuff decays anyway. And I also like that it's kind of cut right in half. If you squint, the top half looks like it either might be growing or still in flesh, but then the bottom half kind of is the almost circular pattern of the yin yang feel.
Right. Which also reminds me, if I can add this, that it's I had one of my first art exhibition. It was called Liminal Spaces and Nowhere Places, and I'm like obsessed with the concept of liminal space. And I feel like this issue of the journal, it feels very much like reflective of liminal spaces. And I think that piece is sort of like, is it dying? Is it not? You know what I mean? It sort of feels like it's in transition. So it's cool. It's lovely and terrifying, as the artist Jolene Armstrong says herself, as describing her work.
I didn't see like the yin yang similarity. It is, you can't unsee it once you see it. But the kind of the lighter side and the darker side of the inner part of the flower. If you made it far enough into the website, there's somewhere in there where I reference William Blake, not the famous world in a grain of sand line, but we're fans of William Blake in terms of the origin story of Wild Roof Journal. That's where I got the name originally. So that element certainly isn't lost in terms of seeing, the cosmos in this case in a flower rather than a grain of sand, but similar enough where it's a nice parallel. That I was wrong on one of the pieces we talked about last go around with Bonnie Matthews Brock's image. So I'll give this one another shot, and perhaps I'll be wrong again. But it looks digitized. It's not a realistic image of a sunflower, of course, and I'll post it on the website if you're just listening. But that's that kind of cellular and obviously the colorful nature of it kind of calls to mind like a kind of a digitized image where it's not overdone, where it seems kind of fake and too kind of harsh, but kind of really done in a nice, really an interesting way that really is pretty eye-catching. And what I was even drawn to after a couple of looks at it was kind of the edges and the pattern. The pattern in the center obviously draws your eye in because the circular nature of it and the center of the flower, but just the wonderful patterns into the edges of the piece. Like every part of this image is just kind of gives you more and more to look at. So it kind of has that infinite nature working, just in terms of places to look as a viewer. So I like that.
Yeah, very organic looking, although possibly digitized looking, like you were saying, it doesn't lose that organic look and feel. Very organic.
Yeah, absolutely. Actually, a nice kind of connection. Actually, oddly enough, the piece right before this in the issue was selected by Mary Beth to take a closer look at. And that was a friend of the podcast, Anna Genevieve Winham, her piece in Gallery 1, which was called By Jove. So that might be a nice transition there. So Mary Beth, if you wouldn't mind, what stood out to you with the piece By Jove?
Well, there's so much that's interesting about this short piece. But the first thing that struck me was I had just had the great fortune of seeing the four moons of Jupiter really well for the first time in my life. And so when she started talking about Jupiter, I was just like, oh yeah, because it was just so amazing. And then the second thing that struck me was her line about the father, Emma's father, wanting to name things, name the ships that went by in the channel or in the bay. And she said that most masculine of obsessions. And I found that really fascinating too, because I've thought a lot about why we name things. As someone who, sort of an amateur naturalist, I'm knowing the names of animals and plants. And when I go to visit a place, I'm always wanting to know. But then I'm also thinking, why do I think that knowing the name of that flower tells me anything at all? And so I've written about that a little bit. I wrote this piece about oyster catchers years ago, and in The Heart of the Sound, it's one of the chapters in that book where there's these birds I hang out with a lot in Prince William Sound, and just really knowing their names is like next to nothing. And even learning what you find out in a bird book or in a biology text is still just scratching the surface. Like mainly you just need to hang out with them and continually remove your human filters as much as possible. So that really struck about this piece too, and the sort of masculine feminine thing going on there in terms of how we relate to the world, how we think about intelligence, like what is knowledge. So she also has a line, the way two different knowledges felt, that Emma had this experience of knowing planets, but not until she actually saw them. That different knowledge base opens up this idea of all the different knowledge bases that exist, not only within the human community, but even further than that. And I also was reminded of a book that I read many years ago called The Names of Things. And it's kind of not very well known. Susan Brind Morrow, and the subtitle is A Passage in the Egyptian Desert. And so it's kind of a travel memoir about her time in Egypt. But she talks a lot about language. One, because she's trying to learn the Egyptian language, which is very different than English, but also because she's just thinking again about that question of what do the names of things mean and how do we define that? So that was what really pulled me to this piece. And then the other thing, kind of funny, but also related, is the title, By Jove. For some reason, what popped into my head was that line from My Fair Lady, which is really by George instead of by Jove. But in my memory, it was by Jove. I think she's got it. You know, when and that story, if you remember, is about taking this poor English woman who doesn't speak proper English and trying to teach her proper English and proper ways of being. So going back to that idea of like, what is knowledge and how do we basically, how do we think we know anything at all? I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, I really like that. You kind of landed on that kind of question after reading it.
I don't think I could articulate it better than Mary Beth did, but I think, definitely the male-female thing going on there, I felt very strongly. And I especially liked the part about, I'm looking at it to make sure I quote it properly, but the quote is, moons weren't the shy children of the planets, but rather the Oedipal sons, trying always to escape their fathers, but being pulled into eternal return. And then talking about also the moon trying to free herself from the narcissistic clutches, from the controlling clutches of a narcissistic mom. So I thought, that gives us a lot to sort of think about. I seem to be focused on like pieces and stories that are able to kind of shift your perspective on things in pretty big ways. And I thought that those are two very different perspectives, very close proximity.
I don't want to push too hard with kind of drawing similarities, but what I liked about this in combination with the previous image that we just looked at, Sunflower Cosmos, where it's kind of had the microscopic view and the cosmic view together. So we're thinking about the family unit, family dynamics, family interactions, that familiar territory there, but then also considering, one's place in the larger cosmic perspective. So there was that dynamic going on there. And obviously there's a lot of talk about planets and space, and even the word cosmos is used near the end or pretty close to the end of the piece, which sometimes I just go for a literal approach of placement of what to place next to what. So that was a nice one. It made my job easy. I can just cosmos, put those together, and what do you know? They actually do intersect with some pretty interesting themes, as it turns out.
Well, and I don't have it in front of me, so I can't remember the name of the indigenous peoples that she talks about in there. Anyhow, but that idea of traditional ecological knowledge is also important to, think about in terms of what do we mean when we say we know something. And I love that their way of viewing things is that you can't say anything about it unless you're actually present. Like the line, when Columbus discovered America, well, were you actually there? Like, did you actually see that happen? I thought that was brilliant and really a powerful addition to this, layered piece.
Yeah, that's really interesting. That just reminded me of my husband years ago published a book called The Clumsiest People in Europe. And it's about this woman, Mrs. Mortimer, a real woman who existed. And she wrote about all the countries of the world without ever having left her tiny town in Wales. And so she had all sorts of interesting ideas about, the Portuguese and this and that. It was just very funny. And the text was used to teach children about the countries of the world at one time. So anyway, I just happened to think of good old Mrs. Mortimer when you were saying, and you had to have been there because Miss Mortimer was never anywhere to talk about. Anyway, I digress.
Yeah, nice. Yeah, maybe we'll take a turn into the other prose piece. Which is nice, and then it was Rachel's other selection. Brent Atkinson's story Red Eyes.
Yes.
So speaking of what was placed next to what, this was the one that immediately preceded your image.
Yes.
So you'd
But
have
that's not
you'd
I
have
chose. That's not. Okay. I'll tell you why I did choose it though.
and I'll say
I
too, this was a longer piece, so it's one that, if you're interested in it, you could sit down with it, and it's more than just a poem or a flash piece. What kind of drew you in? Because this one was a little bit more of a longer form, which we don't publish a lot of.
Yeah, it's longer form, but it's still a short story, and I mean, at least for me, it is. And I am, my attention span. I am certain I have undiagnosed ADD. My attention span, short stories are perfect for me. So I know it's a longer form for the journal, but anyway, what I tend to be drawn toward, first of all, right away, I was pulled into the sort of the atmosphere of this sort of cold, not rural, but cold, like I just felt like I was there. I was pulled into the place immediately. I'm lacking the words to describe the place, but I was pulled there. And it's, sometimes I imagine myself, despite having lived in New York City for 16 years and choosing to live in a town that just, where you can get to the city very easily. I sort of long for part of me really imagines or fantasizes about living in a place like that, where you're just sort of, you're just surrounded by nature, beautiful, nature's beauty, and your priorities shift, and your tasks are different, and your interactions with people are different, and all of that. So right away, I was pulled in to that place, and then I found like so much interesting about that piece. The protagonist, and I'm forgetting the protagonist's name, but the protagonist is a young guy and he's living alone. And what I really thought was interesting, and it reminded me of someone I know, is that he was taught early on, he said, not to sort of trudge on with his work and to not feel, pain, be it physical or emotional, physical or emotional, to kind of like just brush it aside and carry on with your work, right? So that to me comes up. It's something I find very interesting, and it came up several times in the piece. It's a theme that's repeated. So he cuts his hand, and then he didn't even notice that he cut his hand for a while, and it wasn't until he saw blood dripping in the snow, and then he continued on his merry way. And then he also is still sort of grappling with the end of a relationship, and it seems, and doesn't seem like he wants to feel. He's not able to process it because he doesn't want to feel any of these uncomfortable feelings that can come along with the end of a relationship. Sadness, regret. I don't know. I don't really know what else is going on in internally for him. So there's that. And that to me contrasted with the fact that he sits in front of this journal every night, right, to write about things. And it's like he says he has thoughts and reflections, and he's staring at these pages and he's not able to express anything because he can't get in touch with himself internally. And I thought, that's quite a chore. You're trying to write in a journal every night, and you've been taught to do everything other than look internally. So it seems that at one point he had been able to write in this journal because he had pages that were full in the past, but he can't do it right now. And then I also really enjoyed the contrast of, like, he seemed like a very sort of rigid routine, like very routine life, right? He got up, he had his cigarette, he, did what he had to do. He walked, to the river, to the water, et cetera, et cetera. And so he's like, there's the rigidity of his life versus sort of like the wildness of what he's surrounded by, nature, nature. And I thought that was an interesting contrast too. So those are some of my initial thoughts. I mean, I think there's probably more to, there was an interaction that he has with a man who he had never seen, but he sees tracks in the snow. And it turns out he runs into this guy one day, and the guy's a wolf hunter, it turns out. And I know there's something to that interaction that's also significant, but I haven't quite been able to process that or put that into words yet myself. But I really thought, to me, I'm more character focused when I'm more interested in characters. If I had to pick between good characters and a good storyline, I'm all about the character. And this character to me was someone I wanted to know more about. I actually felt like, as a former clinical social worker, I wanted to kind of get in there. I wanted to help him get to know himself. There's a word called interoception, which means it's almost like another sense, right? Where you sense everything that's going on with yourself internally. How did that sense get blunted for him? And how can he sort of like resensitize himself to things that are going on with himself internally?
Yeah, resensitize is huge. I love that you put a word to one of so many things that was flying through my brain when I encountered this. The first encounter was strange because immediately I'm looking for description. I'm looking for kind of details, and I didn't see him, and yet I got completely drawn into the world. Now, partly that's not fair because I'm bringing a lot of software preloaded from loving Jack Kerouac and going through my Hemingway period and Cormac McCarthy. So a guy out in the wilderness, particularly in winter, I mean, that's just calling in a whole bunch of preloaded software. But he really did it. He invoked something that was original, and I'm not quite sure how he did it because I'm looking for this high definition description, but he was able to create that atmosphere in pretty high definition anyway, which made it more atmospheric, I think. And of course, you got a mystery factor. So we got some footprints. We don't know where they're going. We're not really sure what he's thinking. And I'm always hypercritical if it looks a little bit like Hemingway, because I went through this phase. I didn't originate this term. I think it was George Saunders that says every male author has to outgrow his Hemingway boner, or he wants to write like Hemingway, wants to be like Hemingway. And it's just, you have to kind of go through that process and then come out the other side. Very few authors, it seems like, are able to kind of stay within that minimalist, man against nature, very internal, very psychological. But you've got a male character who clearly wants to have the introspective thoughts or resensitize, but he's in this isolated situation where he's trapped with himself. And I could kind of feel it coming, but it still made perfect intuitive sense. He's trapped with himself. He can't quite articulate. The resensitization isn't happening. So, of course, the rye whiskey that's in the writer's desk sends him out into the wilderness in his underwear. That was a scene where I kind of nodded and said, it could have been predictable. If I saw it in a movie, I'd say, oh, that's the scene that should happen now. That's the right beat. But it was still completely authentic. It still felt real, even though the move, the arc, the story arc felt familiar, which I think was more to serve the character rather than the plot. That's why I think it worked for me.
Agreed. Well said.
So I thought of Jack London in The Call of the Wild because the character's name is Jack, right? So yeah, a lot of preloaded stuff for me too. And I've written a lot about wolves. I wrote a book called Among Wolves with a biologist who studied wolves for 40 years in Alaska. And so whenever I see a wolf in a story, I put my guard up because there's so much misinformation about them. And, it's a real struggle because we have so many cliches in literature, like, the lone wolf. And, what Dr. Haber found out is that a lone wolf is basically a dead wolf. They cannot really survive on their own. They're pack animals, they're community animals, kind of like humans. And so I so I always come at things that way. And then, of course, the wolf hunter will. I won't even talk about that. But, but except to say, I wasn't really quite sure. The wolf hunter seemed to be this character that was both appeared to be sort of, wanted to make sure this dude was okay by saying, take care of yourself. But then he also seemed to be a dangerous character, which is more how I interpreted it, that sometimes, and maybe I'm reading too much into this, but one of my takeaways from it was, sometimes when you're out in the wild, that still the most dangerous animal out there is a human. And like, I remember reading something years ago about women who hike by themselves, and their biggest fear is running into, another human that might harm them, not a bear or a wolf or, Wolverine or, cougar. It's just not. And so it's that was one of the things that I drew from the story. But again, basically, I think, Rachel, what you were saying is that it's as much about the other thing that we confront when we're alone in the wilderness is ourselves.
Mhm.
And perhaps, confronting ourselves is the most terrifying of all, right? Because we have to look at ourselves. And like you pointed out, Rachel, this is a character who doesn't, really, he's not in touch with himself. So yeah, I thought it was an interesting piece. Thanks for bringing it up, Rachel.
Aaron, your sound might be going wonky again. It was staticky, and right now I think no audio from your end. Check 1, 2. And now we have our intermission, so feel free to move about the cabin.
We're just the music for the internet.
Yeah, right.
Old
Find the most annoying phone hold music possible.
Well, Rachel, I'll take this interruption to tell you how much I appreciated your piece in this issue too. It's really gorgeous.
Thanks. Thank you so much.
It's very evocative. Is it oil?
It is alcohol ink and pigment stick, which is oil paint mixed with just enough wax to be in a solid form. So yeah, I tend to paint a lot of, I never know what I'm creating when I start painting. And I end up creating a lot of sort of dreamy looking landscapes and places that I imagine are a lot like where Jack was, because I think either I was there, I was living that way in another life, or maybe that's really where I belong. But thank you for the kind words. That it means a lot. It's not external validation is not why anybody creates art, but it really does feel good when it resonates with someone. So thanks for telling me.
Sure. Yeah.
But yeah, Mary Beth's final selection, the poem For the American Robin. John Hanson was the poet.
Yeah. So this one, it just really got me because he's using very plain language. It's very straightforward. It's, I think, a poem that anyone, even people who say, I don't understand poetry, could understand. And I always appreciate that, because we do want poetry to be read by more people. And so it's very plain language, and the robin too is a very common bird. I mean, it's one of the most ubiquitous species on this continent. And there are corollaries in Europe too, robins. And so I liked those two things about it. And also it was just very heartfelt. And this idea that nowhere is unoccupied or vacant, I think is more important now than ever. That, I think we're learning that everywhere is someone's home. Like the more we learn about ecology, the more we learn about places, even the deep sea vents of the ocean, like everywhere, there's somebody living there. Not a place that's unoccupied or vacant or desolate or, some of these words that we throw at places where at first glance looks like nobody's there. and we can do what we want with them. So I really liked that theme in this poem, and that he focused on a single incident. He didn't do what I just did, was this big, broad, vague stroke. He focused on a single bird and a single incident of a single little bit of land getting developed, and to illustrate this larger idea. And I think he did a really good idea. And it kind of resonated with that other essay. I can't remember the name of it now, just where he talks about bird watching, and he says, well, that's just a so-and-so. And then he ends the essay with, where is it? The name of it is Just Gone By. That's the name of the essay, also in this issue. And I like that idea too, that, it's not just a field or just a robin, the way we use that word just to kind of be dismissive and say, it doesn't matter. So anyhow, for those reasons, I really appreciate this poem.